My granddaughter called me outdated. Then she needed the archive. Only I had the email arrived at 6 in the morning, which told me everything about the sender's state of mind. Meredith had not written to me in 14 months. I knew this because I had counted, the way a man counts the days since rain when his garden begins to yellow. The subject line read, "Urgent, need your help ASAP," and the body contained exactly 3 sentences. She needed access to my archive. She needed it within the week. She hoped I was doing well. I sat with my coffee and read those sentences 4 times. The radiator ticked in the corner of my study, and outside, frost still clung to the edges of the windows. I'm 73 years old, and I have learned that urgency in others often reveals what patience has always known. Meredith needed something from the man she had called a relic. I wondered if she remembered saying that word to my face, or if it had simply slipped from her memory the way my birthday card seemed to slip from her calendar. The archive she mentioned fills 3 rooms of my house. 41 years of collecting, organizing, and preserving the documents that trace our family's path through American history. Land deeds from the 1840s, letters written during the Civil War, photographs that predate electricity, immigration papers, marriage certificates, military records, and the quiet paper trail of ordinary people who built something lasting without ever expecting recognition. My wife Eleanor called it my cathedral. My son Daniel called it a waste of space. Meredith, when she was 22 and flush with her first graduate school acceptance, called it a dusty hobby for someone who could not accept that the past was dead. I closed the laptop and finished my coffee. The past, I have found, has a habit of returning precisely when the living need it most. I should explain how I became the keeper of these records, because it matters to what came later. My father was a quiet man who worked in insurance and spent his evenings reading history. He never went to college, but he read more widely than most professors I've met. When I was 12, he took me to the county courthouse and showed me how to look up property records. He taught me that every family leaves a trail, and that trail tells a story more honest than the one we tell ourselves at holiday dinners. He died when I was 34, and among his possessions, I found 6 boxes of documents he had gathered over decades. Some were originals. Others were careful copies made on a typewriter. A few were photographs of gravestones from cemeteries in 3 different states. I could have thrown them away. My wife was pregnant with Daniel, and we had just bought our first house, and there were 100 practical reasons to clear out the clutter. But I sat in my father's empty apartment and read a letter from his grandfather, written in 1918, describing the first time he saw the Rocky Mountains. The handwriting was careful and slanted, and the paper smelled like age itself. I understood then that I was holding something irreplaceable, not valuable in the way a bank measures value, but precious in a way that has no market price. I spent the next 4 decades expanding what my father had started. I learned to read Old German script because half our family came from Bavaria. I taught myself the basics of archival preservation. I traveled to courthouses in 6 states and spent hours in church basements looking through records that no one had touched in generations. I built a climate-controlled room in my basement with proper shelving and acid-free storage boxes. I created a cataloging system that would allow anyone to find any document within minutes. Eleanor supported all of it, even when the expenses added up, even when I spent weekends transcribing fragile letters instead of attending neighborhood barbecues. She understood that some work matters beyond its immediate utility. Daniel did not inherit this understanding. He became an accountant, which is a respectable profession, but he measures the world in columns that must balance by day's end. When Eleanor died 8 years ago, Daniel suggested I sell the house and move into a smaller place. What he meant, though he was too careful to say it directly, was that I should dispose of the archive and live out my years in efficient comfort. I declined. He did not argue, but I saw the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was calculating the eventual cost of my stubbornness. Meredith is Daniel's only child. She was a bright girl who read early and asked questions that surprised her teachers. I remember when she was 9, and I showed her a photograph of her great-great-grandmother standing in front of a sod house in Nebraska. Meredith studied the image for a long time, then asked why the woman looked so tired. I told her that survival is exhausting work. She nodded as if she understood something important. I thought then that she might be the one to continue what I had built. I was wrong about that, but I was wrong in a particular way that took years to become clear. Meredith excelled through school and into a prestigious doctoral program in American history. I was proud of her, genuinely proud, and I told her so at her graduation party. She thanked me in the distracted way young people thank older relatives, already looking past my shoulder toward someone more interesting. That was the first small sting, though I did not recognize it as such. I assumed she was simply busy with her future. The second sting came 3 years later, when I offered to share my archive with her research. She was working on her dissertation, something about land ownership patterns in the 19th century Midwest, and I knew I had documents that would be useful. Original land patents, correspondence between settlers and land agents, a diary kept by a woman who traveled from Ohio to Kansas in 1867. I wrote Meredith a careful letter explaining what I had and offering to help her access it. Her response was polite but dismissive. She appreciated the offer, but her methodology relied on institutional archives with verifiable provenance. Private collections, she explained, presented authentication problems that could undermine scholarly credibility. She was sure I understood. I understood more than she realized. I understood that she was embarrassed by me. The grandfather with his basement full of old papers did not fit the image she wanted to project. Her advisors were sophisticated academics, and she was positioning herself to join their ranks. A family historian with no advanced degrees and no institutional affiliation was a liability, not an asset. I did not argue. I simply filed her letter in the folder I keep for correspondence and continued my work, but I noticed that her visits became less frequent after that. She stopped asking about the archive. When she came to Daniel's house for holidays, she spoke to me with the careful patience one reserves for elderly relatives whose hobbies are harmless but irrelevant. The word outdated came at Thanksgiving 4 years ago. I had mentioned something about a genealogical discovery I had made, tracing one branch of the family to a settlement in Pennsylvania that predated the Revolution. Meredith smiled tightly and said that modern historians had moved beyond what she called antiquarian genealogy. The field now focused on structural analysis and theoretical frameworks, not on collecting dusty documents. She said I was outdated, and she said it with the casual confidence of someone who has never been wrong about anything that mattered. The table went quiet. Daniel looked at his plate. His wife pretended to need something from the kitchen. I finished my meal without responding, because there was nothing to say that would change her mind, and arguing with certainty is a waste of energy. After dinner, I drove home alone. Eleanor would have known what to say to comfort me, but Eleanor was gone, and the house was dark, and I sat in my study for a long time looking at the boxes that held 4 generations of my family's story. That was the last Thanksgiving I attended at Daniel's house. I send cards and gifts for birthdays and holidays. I answer the phone when they call, which is not often. I do not pretend that we are estranged because that word implies drama and confrontation. We have simply drifted into a polite distance that neither side works to bridge. I am an old man who lives alone with his archive, and they are a busy family with modern concerns. The mathematics of affection have their own logic. So when Meredith's email arrived that frost-covered morning, I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to the recognition a chess player feels when an opponent makes a move that changes the entire board. I waited 2 days before responding. This was not cruelty, though I suspect Meredith interpreted it that way. I needed time to think about what she was actually asking and what it would mean to give it. I wrote back with a simple question. What exactly did she need from the archive? Her reply came within an hour. She was applying for a tenure-track position at a respected university. The competition was fierce, and she had advanced to the final round. But there was a complication. Her dissertation had included a chapter on a particular family's land acquisition in Missouri during the 1850s. She had argued that this family represented a pattern of exploitation that characterized westward expansion. The argument had earned praise from her committee and helped secure her current position as a visiting professor. But another scholar had recently published a book that contradicted her interpretation. This scholar argued that the family in question had acquired their land through legitimate purchase and had maintained fair dealings with neighboring settlers, including several indigenous families who remained in the area. The new book included archival evidence that Meredith had not found, and it called her conclusions into question. The hiring committee had asked her to respond to the contradiction. If she could not defend her original argument or acknowledge its limitations with scholarly integrity, she would likely lose the position. Her entire career trajectory depended on what she could prove about events that happened 170 years ago. The family in the new book was ours. I read her email 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. The family whose land practices she had criticized in her dissertation was the same family whose records filled 17 boxes in my basement. The Harrington branch, my grandmother's people, who had settled in Missouri in 1852 and remained there until my grandmother moved east to marry my grandfather in 1921. Meredith had written about her own ancestors without knowing they were her ancestors, and she had gotten the story wrong. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window at the winter bare trees. A cardinal landed on the feeder Eleanor had installed years ago. The red against the gray was sharp and clean, the kind of color that wakes you up to what you are seeing. Meredith had not just dismissed my archive. She had built part of her career on a misreading of history that my archive could correct, and now, with that career hanging in the balance, she needed me to save her. I took a walk that afternoon, despite the cold. Walking helps me think, and I needed to think clearly about what I wanted to do. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets salted against ice, the houses closed up against the chill. I passed the home of a widow named Helen who waves to me most mornings. I passed the small park where Eleanor and I used to sit on summer evenings, watching the children play while the light turned golden. I thought about what it means to hold on to something for decades, believing it matters, only to have the people closest to you dismiss it until they need it. The question was not whether I had what Meredith needed. I knew I did. The Harrington papers were among the most complete collections in the archive because my grandmother had been a meticulous keeper of records and her mother before her. I had letters, land documents, account books, and a diary kept by Samuel Harrington himself from 1851 to 1879. I had the very evidence that could either support Meredith's argument or destroy it. The question was what I would ask in return. I am not a vindictive man. Eleanor used to say that my capacity for holding grudges was dangerously low, that I forgave too easily and let people off the hook when they deserved to stay caught. She was probably right. But this situation felt different. Meredith had not just insulted me at a dinner table. She had dismissed 40 years of work, called me outdated to my face, and refused to engage with the archive when I offered it freely. Now she wanted access because her professional reputation depended on it. There was a lesson here, and I was not sure whether teaching it was my responsibility or my right. I returned home as the sun was setting, the sky turning shades of rose and amber that reminded me of the watercolors Eleanor used to paint. I made myself a simple dinner, washed the dishes, and then went to the basement to find the Harrington boxes. The familiar smell greeted me at the bottom of the stairs. Old paper, cedar from the shelving, the faint chemical trace of the archival supplies I use for preservation. I turned on the lights, and the room came into focus, shelves running floor to ceiling along 3 walls, each box labeled with family name, date range, and content type. A long table in the center for examining documents, a magnifying lamp, cotton gloves and a dispenser by the door, the tools of a craft that Meredith had called a dusty hobby. The Harrington papers filled 17 boxes, as I had remembered. I pulled the first one from the shelf and set it on the table. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, were the earliest documents, Samuel Harrington's land patent from 1852, signed by the Federal Land Office in St. Louis, a letter to his brother describing the journey from Kentucky, a hand-drawn map of the property with annotations about soil quality and water sources. I worked through the boxes slowly, refreshing my memory of what I had. The diary was in box 14, a leather-bound volume with pages gone brown at the edges. Samuel's handwriting was small and precise, the product of a schoolmaster's training. I opened to a random page and read an entry from April 1858 describing the planting of an orchard and the help received from a Osage man named Clearwater, who knew which trees would thrive in that soil. This was the kind of detail that changed narratives. Meredith's dissertation had apparently argued that families like the Harringtons displaced indigenous peoples and claimed land through a system designed to exclude them. But here was Samuel Harrington writing about his friendship with Clearwater, about the fair exchange of labor and knowledge, about the meals they shared and the respect they maintained. It was not a story of exploitation. It was a story of neighbors figuring out how to coexist on land that was changing hands by forces larger than any of them. I closed the diary and sat in the quiet of my basement. The radiator had clicked off, and the only sound was the faint hum of the dehumidifier that keeps the room stable. I thought about what Meredith would do with this evidence. Would she acknowledge that her original argument was flawed? Would she revise her understanding of her own family? Or would she find a way to minimize what these documents revealed, using them just enough to save her career while maintaining the framework she had built? I did not know, and I realized that not knowing was part of what made this difficult. Meredith was asking me to trust her with something precious, and she had given me no reason to offer that trust. I went upstairs and wrote her another email. I told her that I had reviewed the Harrington collection and that it did contain significant materials relevant to her situation. I told her that I would be willing to discuss access, but that I wanted to meet in person first. I said she was welcome to visit whenever her schedule allowed. Her response came the next morning. She could come Saturday. Would that work? I said it would. The days between that exchange and Saturday's visit passed in the usual rhythms. I read, I walked, I attended to the small maintenance tasks that keep an old house standing. I called my friend Harold, who taught history at the community college for 30 years before retiring, and I described the situation without using Meredith's name. Harold listened carefully and then asked a single question. What did I want to happen? I told him I was not sure yet. He said that uncertainty was probably the most honest answer I could give. Saturday arrived cold and gray, the kind of winter day that makes you grateful for heat and shelter. Meredith's car pulled into my driveway at exactly 10 because she has always been punctual. I watched from the window as she sat behind the wheel for a moment, looking at the house where she had played as a child, where she had once asked me to tell her stories about the old photographs. Then she got out, straightened her coat, and walked to the front door. I opened it before she knocked. She looked older than the last time I had seen her, which was at Daniel's house nearly 2 years ago for a birthday dinner I had attended against my better judgment. There were lines around her eyes now, and her hair had a few strands of gray that she had not bothered to cover. She was 34, entering the years when youth stops being automatic and becomes something you have to maintain. "Grandpa," she said, "thank you for seeing me." I stepped back to let her in. The house was warm, and I had made coffee, and the study where I spend most of my time was tidy in the way that happens when you are expecting judgment. She looked around as if seeing the place for the first time. Her eyes moved across the bookshelves, the framed photographs, the small touches that Eleanor had chosen, and that I have never changed. She paused at the picture of my father, standing in front of the courthouse where he taught me to find records. "I remember that photo," she said. "He looked so serious." "He was a serious man." She turned back to me. "I suppose we should talk about what I need." I gestured to the chairs by the window. She sat in the one Eleanor used to prefer, which gave me a small pang that I did not show. I took the other chair and waited. Meredith explained her situation more fully than she had in the emails. The competing book was by a scholar named Patterson, who had spent a decade in Missouri archives uncovering documents that complicated the standard narrative of westward expansion. Patterson's work argued that many settler families maintained complex, sometimes cooperative relationships with indigenous communities, and that reducing this history to a simple story of displacement missed important nuances. The Harrington family was one of Patterson's key examples. Meredith's dissertation had used the Harringtons differently. She had found land records and government documents that showed the family acquiring substantial acreage through the federal system, and she had placed this within a framework of structural dispossession. She had not looked for evidence of cooperation because her framework did not require it. Now, Patterson's book had exposed the gap in her research, and the hiring committee wanted to know how she had missed it. "The problem," she said, "is that Patterson had access to family papers that I didn't know existed, private collections that were donated to a regional historical society after her book was already in press. She found letters and diaries that complicate my argument significantly. And you think my archive might help you respond?" She nodded. "Grandpa, I know I've been dismissive. I was young and arrogant, and I thought I knew what serious scholarship looked like. I was wrong about that. I understand now that your collection is significant." I let the silence sit for a moment. Outside, a squirrel ran along the fence line, quick and purposeful. "You called me outdated," I said. "You said that to my face at a family dinner in front of everyone." She closed her eyes briefly. "I know. I'm sorry. That was cruel and unnecessary. It was also wrong. Yes, it was also wrong." I stood and walked to the window. The squirrel had found something in the snow and was digging with intense focus. "When I offered to help with your dissertation, you told me that private collections had authentication problems. You said your methodology required institutional sources. I was following what my advisors told me. They said, 'I am not interested in what your advisors said. I am interested in what you decided.'" She was quiet. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The house was full of small sounds that become familiar when you live alone. "I decided that my career was more important than my family," she finally said. "I decided that your work didn't fit my image of what I wanted to be. I was wrong about that too." I turned back to face her. She was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap, and there was something in her expression that I had not seen before. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to the exhaustion I had seen in that photograph of her great-great-grandmother standing in front of the sod house. "Why do you want this position so much?" I asked. The question seemed to surprise her. "It's tenure track, at a good school. It's what I've been working toward for years. That is what the position is." I asked why you want it. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I watched her think, really think, for perhaps the first time in our conversation. "Because I want to matter," she said. "I want to do work that lasts. I want to teach students and write books and contribute something that outlives me." "And if this position does not work out? If Patterson's book ends your career trajectory? What then?" "Then I've wasted 15 years of my life." I sat back down in my chair. "Your great-great-grandmother spent 15 years on that Nebraska claim. She watched 2 children die of fever and buried a husband who was kicked by a horse. She nearly lost the farm 3 times to drought and once to a bank that tried to foreclose during the Panic of 1873. When she finally had the deed clear and free, she was 41 years old, and her hands were so damaged from work that she could barely hold a pen. She wrote in her diary that she had not wasted a single day because every day had taught her what survival required." Meredith was watching me with an expression I could not read. "The archive is full of stories like that," I continued. "People who built things that did not last, who raised children they never got to see grow old, who worked toward futures they never reached. They are not wasted lives, they are the lives that made your life possible. And dismissing their records as dusty hobbies is not just an insult to me, it is a misunderstanding of what history actually is." She looked down at her hands. "I understand. I'm not sure you do, but I am willing to find out." I stood again and gestured for her to follow. We went down the basement stairs together, and I turned on the lights, and I watched her face as she took in the scope of what I had built. The neat rows of boxes, the careful labels, the professional-grade preservation environment. Her eyes moved from shelf to shelf, and I saw the recognition. Dawned slowly that this was not a hobby. This was a life's work. "My God," she said quietly. "I had no idea." "You never asked." We stood in the silence of the archive for a long moment. Then I walked to the shelves that held the Harrington papers and pulled down the first box. "This is what you need," I said. 17 boxes covering the period from 1851 to 1921. Original documents, correspondence, account books, and Samuel Harrington's diary. If you want to understand what actually happened to that family, it is all here." She reached out as if to touch the box, then stopped herself. "Can I see the diary?" I found it in its proper place and handed it to her. She opened it carefully, with the respect one should show old paper, and I noticed that her hands were steady. She read in silence for several minutes, turning pages with the tips of her fingers, her lips moving slightly as she worked through Samuel's careful script. Finally, she looked up. "This changes everything." Yes. Patterson was right. My argument was wrong. The Harringtons weren't just participating in a system of dispossession. They were trying to figure out how to live ethically within a system they didn't design. She closed the diary gently. I missed all of this because I wasn't looking for it. That is often how we miss things. She set the diary on the table and turned to face me fully. Her eyes were wet, though she did not cry. "Grandpa, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you years of respect I didn't give. I looked at what you built and I saw something embarrassing instead of something remarkable. That says more about me than it does about you." I nodded slowly. "It says something about what you were taught to value." "Yes, but I'm 34 years old. At some point, I have to stop blaming my training and start taking responsibility for my own choices." This was the moment I had been waiting for, though I had not known exactly what form it would take. Meredith was standing in my archive, surrounded by the work I had done over 4 decades, holding evidence that could save or destroy her career, and she was finally seeing clearly. Not because I had lectured her or punished her, but because the situation demanded honesty, and she had found enough courage to provide it. "I will give you access to everything you need," I said, "but I have conditions." She nodded, waiting. "First, you will cite this archive properly in whatever you write, not as a private collection with questionable provenance, but as the Harrington family archive held by your grandfather, who spent 40 years preserving it. You will acknowledge that serious scholarship can come from outside institutional walls. Of course. Second, you will spend time here learning how I organize this collection, not just taking what you need, but understanding the system I built. If you are going to use family history in your work, you should know how family historians actually work." She hesitated, then nodded. Again. "That's fair. Third, and this is the most important condition." I paused, making sure she was listening. "You will tell the truth in whatever you write. If the evidence in these boxes contradicts your original argument, you will say so clearly and completely. You will not minimize or spin or find clever ways to preserve your framework while acknowledging its problems. You will be honest about what you got wrong and why." Meredith was quiet for a long moment. I could see her thinking through what this would mean for her career, her reputation, her relationship with the scholars she had hoped to impress. Honesty is expensive, and she was calculating the cost. "If I do that," she said slowly, "I might not get this position. The committee might see it as a sign of weakness. Admitting you were wrong is not always rewarded in academia. Then you will have learned something valuable about academia." She almost smiled. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "Making it easy would not help you, and it would dishonor the people in these boxes who did not have easy lives." She turned back to the shelves, her gaze moving across the rows of labeled boxes. "You really believe that, don't you? That these records matter? That the truth matters more than careers or reputations?" "I believe that the truth is the only thing that lasts. Careers end, reputations shift. Institutions change their minds about what counts as serious scholarship. But the truth about what happened, preserved carefully and passed down honestly, that is the only legacy worth protecting." Meredith reached out and touched the spine of a box labeled Correspondence, 1860-1870. Her fingers rested there for a moment, as if she could feel the weight of the letters inside. "My great-great-grandmother," she said, "the one in the Nebraska photograph. What happened to her?" I walked to another section of shelves and found the box I was looking for. "Margaret Harrington. She lived to be 78. After her husband died, she ran the farm alone for 11 years, then sold it to a younger family and moved to town. She spent her last years writing letters to her grandchildren and tending a small garden. When she died, she left instructions for her papers to be kept together and passed down through the family." I handed Meredith a photograph from the box. It showed an older woman sitting on a porch, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neither happy nor sad, but something settled and complete. "She looks peaceful," Meredith said. "She had done what she set out to do. She raised children, kept a home, survived things that would have broken most people, and she preserved the records of her life because she believed someone would want to know the truth about how she lived." Someone did. Yes, me. And now, perhaps you. Meredith handed back the photograph. "I'll do it," she said. "All of it. The citations, the training, the honesty. Whatever it costs me professionally, I'll do it." "Why?" She looked at me, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw the girl who had once asked me why the woman in the photograph looked so tired. "Because I don't want to be the person who lies about her own family to get a job. And because you're right. The truth is the only thing that lasts." We spent the rest of that day in the archive. I showed her my cataloging system, explained the preservation methods I used, walked her through the logic of how I organized documents to make them findable. She asked questions that surprised me with their sharpness, and she listened to my answers with the attention I had hoped for years ago. By the time evening came, we had made a plan for her to return the following weekend to begin systematic research. At the door, she paused. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you got my email, the first one asking for help, what did you think?" I considered the question carefully. I thought that the past has a way of returning to us, whether we want it to or not, and I thought that you had finally reached a point where you needed to learn something I had been trying to teach you for years. "What's that?" "That we are not separate from the people who came before us. Their choices shaped our choices. Their stories are our stories, and ignoring that connection doesn't make us modern or sophisticated. It just makes us lost." She nodded slowly. "I think I'm starting to understand." I watched her drive away in the fading light. The house was quiet again, but the quiet felt different now, less like loneliness, more like the silence after a storm has passed. Meredith returned the following weekend, and the weekend after that. She brought a laptop and careful notes, and a willingness to learn that she had never shown before. We worked through the Harrington papers together, and I taught her how to read old handwriting, how to cross-reference documents to verify dates and claims, how to build a picture of a family's life from the fragments they left behind. What she found in those boxes changed her understanding of her own field. The Harringtons were not villains or heroes. They were people navigating a world of difficult choices, trying to act ethically within systems that often made ethics impossible. Samuel's diary recorded both his pride in building a successful farm and his unease about the treaties that had cleared the land for settlement. He questioned himself on the page in ways that complicated any simple narrative about westward expansion. Meredith wrote her response to the hiring committee over several weeks. She showed me drafts, and I offered suggestions, and together we shaped an argument that acknowledged what she had gotten wrong while demonstrating what she had learned. She cited my archive extensively with full attribution, and she included photographs of original documents that supported her revised analysis. The committee was impressed, not because she had defended her original position, but because she had shown the intellectual courage to revise it. She got the job. But that is not the end of this story. The end came 6 months later, when Meredith published her first major article from her new position. It was about the ethics of family archives, and it argued that private collections maintained by dedicated amateurs often preserve truths that institutional archives miss. She used our family as a case study, and she wrote about what she had learned in my basement with a humility that surprised everyone who had known her before. She sent me a copy before it was published. I read it at my desk, in the study where Eleanor's watercolors still hang on the walls, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not vindication, exactly. Something closer to hope. Meredith called that evening to ask what I thought. "It is honest," I said, "and it is well written, and it says things that needed to be said. I couldn't have written it without you, without the archive, without everything you taught me. You could have. You just would not have." She laughed, and it was the first time I had heard her laugh without reservation since she was a child. "That's probably true. The question now is what comes next." There was a pause on the line. I've been thinking about that. I want to learn how to do what you do. Really learn it, not just the basics. I want to understand how to build an archive that will last. Why? Because someone has to continue this after you're gone, and because I don't want to be the generation that loses what you spent your life preserving. I looked out the window at the garden Eleanor had planted, dormant now in winter, but still structured, still waiting for spring. The cardinal was back on the feeder, bright red against the gray. Then we have a lot of work to do, I said. Meredith comes to visit regularly now. We spend hours in the archive, and she asks questions, and I answer them. And slowly, she is learning what I know. She brings her own research questions, her own ideas about what the documents might reveal, and sometimes she finds connections I had missed. The collaboration is better than I expected, different from what I imagined, but better. I'm 73 years old, and I've spent my life preserving the records of people who could not speak for themselves. I've been called outdated by people who did not understand what they were dismissing. I've watched the world rush past my quiet work, and I've wondered sometimes whether any of it mattered. Now I know. It mattered because truth outlasts the people who dismiss it. It mattered because the records survived, and the stories they tell are still there for anyone patient enough to read them. It mattered because a granddaughter who once called me a relic now sits at my table learning how to carry forward what I built. The past is not dead. The past is the foundation we stand on, whether we acknowledge it or not. And the people who preserve it are not outdated. They are the ones who make the future possible. I think Eleanor would have liked this ending. She always said that patience was its own reward. I believe now that she was right, as she was right about most things. Some lessons take decades to teach, and some students take years to learn. But the teaching matters, the learning matters, and the archive, quiet and waiting, holds it all.